Section 15 of the Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1, by Arthur Griffiths. Later Records, Part 2. Women were as capable of fiendish cruelty as men, and displayed greater and more diabolical ingenuity in devising torments for their victims. Two murders typical of this class of crime may be quoted here. One was that committed by the Meatyard's mother and daughter upon an apprentice girl; the other that of Elizabeth Brownrigg, also on an apprentice. The Meatyards kept a millinery shop in Bruton Street, Berkeley Square, and had 5 parish apprentices bound to them. One was a sickly girl, Ann Taylor by name. Being unable to do as much work as her employers desired, they continually vented their spite upon her. After enduring great cruelty, Ann Taylor absconded. She was caught, brought back to Bruton Street, and imprisoned in a garret on bread and water. She again escaped, and was again recaptured and cruelly beaten with a broom handle. Then they tied her with a rope to the door of a room, so that she could neither sit nor lie down, and she was so kept for 3 successive days, but suffered to go to bed at night time. On the 3rd night she was so weak she could hardly creep upstairs. On the 4th day her fellow apprentices were brought to witness her torments as an incentive to exertion, but were forbidden to afford her any kind of relief. On this, the last day of her torture, she faltered in speech and presently expired. The Meatyards now tried to bring their victim to with hartshorn, but finding life was extinct, they carried the body up to the garret and locked it in. Then 4 days later they enclosed it in a box, left the garret door ajar, and spread a report through their house that Nanny had once more absconded. The deceased had a sister, a fellow apprentice, who declared she was persuaded Nanny was dead, whereupon the Meatyards also murdered the sister and secreted the body. Ann's body remained in the garret for a couple of months, when the stench of decomposition was so great that the murderesses feared detection, and after chopping the corpse in pieces, they burnt parts and disposed of others in drains and gully holes. 4 years elapsed without suspicion having been aroused, but there had been constant and violent quarrels between mother and daughter, the former frequently beating and ill-using the latter, who in return reviled her mother as a murderess. During this time the daughter left her home to live with a Mr. Rooker as servant at Ealing. Her mother followed her, and still behaved so outrageously that the daughter, in Mr. Rooker's presence, upbraided her with what they had done. He became uneasy, and cross-questioned them till they confessed the crime. Both women were arrested and tried at the Old Bailey, where they were convicted and sentenced to death. The mother on the morning of her execution was taken with a fit from which she never recovered, and she was in a state of insensibility when hanged. Elizabeth Brownrigg was the wife of a plumber, who carried on business in Flower de Luce Court, Fleet Street. She practised midwifery, and received parish apprentices, whom she took to save the expense of keeping servants. 2 girls, victims of her cruel ill-usage, ran away, but a third, Mary Clifford, bound to her by the parish of Whitefriars, remained to endure still worse. Her inhuman mistress repeatedly beat her, now with a hearth-broom, now with a horsewhip or a cane. The girl was forced to lie at nights in a coal-hole, with no bed but a sack and some straw. She was often nearly perished with cold. Once, after a long diet of bread and water, when nearly starved to death, she rashly broke into a cupboard in search of food, and was caught in the act. Mrs. Brownrigg, to punish her, made her strip, and while she was naked repeatedly beat her with the butt end of a whip. Then fastening a jack chain around her neck, she drew it as tight as possible without strangling, and sent her back to the coal-hole with her hands tied behind her back. Mrs. Brownrigg's son vied with his mother in ill-treating the apprentices, and when the mistress was tired of horsewhipping, the lad continued the savage punishment. When Mary Clifford complained to a French lodger of the barbarity, she experienced. Mrs. Brownrigg flew at her and cut her tongue in 2 places with a pair of scissors. Other apprentices were equally ill used, and they were all covered with wounds and bruises from the cruel flagellations they received. At length one of the neighbours, alarmed by the constant moaning and groanings which issued from Brownrigg's house, began to suspect that the apprentices were treated with unwarrantable severity. It was impossible to gain admission, but a maid looked through a skylight into a covered yard, and saw one of the apprentices, in a shocking state of filth and wretchedness, kept there with a pig. One of the overseers now went and demanded Mary Clifford. Mrs. Brownrigg produced another, Mary Mitchell, who was taken to the workhouse, but in such a pitiable state that in removing her clothes her bodice stuck to her wounds. Mary Mitchell, having been promised that she should not be sent back to Mrs. Brownrigg's, gave a full account of the horrid treatment she and Mary Clifford had received. A further search was made in the Brownriggs' house, but without effect. At length, under threat of removal to prison, Mrs. Brownrigg produced Clifford from a cupboard under a buffet in the dining room. "It is impossible," says the account, "to describe the miserable appearance of this poor girl. Nearly her whole body was ulcerated. Her life was evidently in imminent danger. Having been removed to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, she died there within a few days. The man Brownrigg was arrested, but the woman and son made their escape, shifting their abode from place to place, buying new disguises from time to time at rag fairs. Eventually they took refuge in lodgings at Wandsworth, where they were recognized by their landlord as answering the description of the murderers of Mary Clifford, and arrested. Mrs. Brownrigg was tried and executed. The men, acquitted of the graver charge, were only sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment. The story runs that Hogarth, who prided himself on his skill as a physiognomist, wished to see Mrs. Brownrigg in Newgate. The governor, Mr. Ackerman, admitted him, but at the instance of a mutual friend, played a trick upon the painter by bringing Mrs. Brownrigg before him casually, as some other woman. Hogarth, on looking at her, took Ackerman aside and said, "You must have 2 great female miscreants in your custody, for this woman, as well as Mrs. Brownrigg, is from her features capable of any cruelty and any crime." This story, although ben trovato, is apocryphal. At the time of this alleged visit to Newgate, Hogarth was not alive. I pass now to murders of less atrocity, the result of temporary and more or less ungovernable passion, rather than of malice deliberate and aforethought. In this class be included the case of Mr. Plunkett, a young gentleman of Irish extraction, who murdered a peruke maker when asked an exorbitant price for a wig. Brown had made it to order for Mr. Plunkett, and wanted £7 for it. After haggling he reduced it to 6. Plunkett offered 4, and on this being refused, seized a razor lying handy and cut Brown's throat. A somewhat similar case was that of Mr. Edward Bird, a well-born youth, who had been educated at Eton, and after making the grand tour had received a commission in a regiment of horse. Unfortunately he led a wild, dissolute life, associating with low characters. One morning, after spending the night in a place of public resort, he ordered a bath. One waiter deputed the job to another. The latter went to Bird to apologize for the delay. Bird, growing furious, drew his sword, and made several passes at the waiter, who avoided them by holding the door in his hand, and then escaped downstairs. Bird pursued, threw the man down, breaking his ribs. On this, the master of the house and another waiter, by name Loxton, tried to appease Bird, but the latter, frantic at not having the bath when ordered, fell upon Loxton and ran him through with his sword. Loxton dropped and died almost instantaneously. Bird was arrested, committed to Newgate, and eventually tried for his life. He was convicted and received sentence of death, but great interest was made to get it commuted to transportation. His powerful friends might have attained it but for the protests of Loxton's representatives, and Bird was ordered for execution. The night before he first tried poison, then stabbed himself in several places, but survived to be taken the following morning to Tyburn in a mourning coach, attended by his mother and the ordinary of Newgate. At the gallows he asked for a glass of wine and a pinch of snuff, which he took with apparent unconcern, wishing health to those who stood near him, and then repeated the Apostles' Creed, and was launched into eternity. The military were not over popular at times, when party disputes ran high, and the soldiery were often exposed to contumely in the streets. It must be admitted, too, that they were ready enough to accept any quarrel fastened upon them. Thus William Hawkesworth, a guardsman, while marching through the park with a party to relieve guard at St. James, left the ranks to strike a woman who he thought had insulted his cloth. It was not she, however, but her companion who had cried, "What a stir there is about King George's soldiers!" This companion, by name Ransom, resented the blow, and called Hawkesworth a puppy, whereupon the soldier clubbed his musket and knocked the civilian down. Hawkesworth marched on with his guard. Ransom was removed to the hospital with a fractured skull, and died in a few hours, but a bystander, having learned the name of the offender, obtained a warrant against Hawkesworth, who was committed to Newgate. He was ably defended at his trial, and his commanding officer gave him an excellent character. But the facts were so clearly proved that conviction was imperative. For some time he was buoyed up with the hope of reprieve, but this failed him at the last, and he went to Tyburn solemnly declaring that Ransom hit him first, that he had no malice against the deceased, and he hardly remembered leaving the ranks to strike him. Two cases may well be inserted here, although belonging to a somewhat later date. Both were murders committed under the influence of strong excitement. One was the fierce outburst of passionate despair at unrequited love, the other the rash action of a quick-tempered man who was vested for the moment with absolute power. The first was the murder of Miss Ray by the Reverend James Hackman, the second the flogging to death of the Sergeant Armstrong by order of Colonel Wall, Lieutenant Governor of Goree. Mr. Hackman had held a commission in the 68th Foot, and while employed on the recruiting service at Huntingdon, had been hospitably received at Hinchingbrooke, the seat of Lord Sandwich. At that time a Miss Ray resided there under the protection of his lordship, by whom she had had 9 children. Hackman fell desperately in love with Miss Ray, and the lady did not altogether reject his attentions. A correspondence between them, which bears every appearance of authenticity, was published after the murder under the title of Love and Madness, and the letters on both sides are full of ardent protestations. Hackman continued to serve for some time, but the exile from the sight of his beloved became so intolerable that he sold out, took orders, and entered the church, obtaining eventually the living of Wiverton in Norfolk. He had determined to marry Miss Ray if she would accept him, and one of the last letters of the correspondence above quoted proves that the marriage arrangements were all but completed. On the 1st March 1779 he writes, "In a month or 6 weeks at farthest from this time, I might certainly call you mine. Only remember that my character, now I have taken orders, renders exhibition necessary. By to-night's post I shall write into Norfolk about the alterations at our parsonage." But within a few weeks a cloud overshadowed his life. It is only vaguely indicated in a letter to a friend, dated the 20th March, in which he hints at a rupture between Miss Ray and himself. "What I shall do I know not. Without her I do not think I can exist." A few days later he wrote to the same friend, "Despair goads me on. Death only can relieve me. What then have I to do, who only lived when she loved me, but ceased to live now she ceases to love?" At this period it is evident that the idea of suicide only occupied his overwrought brain. He wrote on the 7th April, "When this reaches you I shall be no more. You know where my affections were placed. My having by some means or other lost hers, an idea which I could not support, has driven me to madness." So far he does not appear to have contemplated any violence against Miss Ray, for in his letter he commends her to the kind offices of his friend. He spent that day in self-communing and in reading a volume of Dr. Blair's sermons. In the evening he went from his lodgings in Duke's Court St. Martin's Lane towards the Admiralty, and saw Miss Ray drive by to the Covent Garden Theatre. He followed her into the theatre and gazed at her for the last time. Then, unable to restrain the violence of his passion, he returned to his lodgings, and having loaded 2 pistols, returned to Covent Garden, where he waited in the piazza till the play was over. When Miss Ray came out he stepped up with a pistol in each hand. One he fired at her, and killed her on the spot. The other he discharged at himself, but without fatal effect. He was at once arrested, and when his wound had been dressed, was committed by Sir John Fielding to Tothill Fields, and afterwards to Newgate. He wrote from prison to the same friend as follows: "I am alive, and she is dead. I shot her, and not myself. Some of her blood and brains are still upon my clothes. I don't ask you to speak to me. I don't ask you to look at me. Only come hither and bring me a little poison, such as is strong enough. Upon my knees I beg, if your friendship for me ever was sincere, do bring me some poison." Next day he was more composed, and declared that nothing should tempt him to escape justice by suicide. "My death," he writes, "is all the recompense I can make to the laws of my country." He was tried before Mr. Justice Blackstone of the Commentaries, and convicted on the clearest evidence. A plea of insanity was set up in his defence, but could not be maintained. His dignified address to the jury had nothing of madness in it, and it is probable that he had no real desire to escape the judgment for his crime. This is shown by his answer to Lord Sandwich, who wrote, 17th April 1779, to Mr. Hackman in Newgate: "If the murderer of Miss wishes to live, the man he has most injured will use all his interest to procure his life." To this Hackman replied: "The condemned cell in Newgate, 17th April 1779. The murderer of her whom he preferred, far preferred to life, respects the hand from which he has just received such an offer as he neither desires nor deserves. His wishes are for death, not life. One wish he has. Could he be pardoned in this world by the man he has most injured? Oh, my lord, when I meet her in another world, enable me to tell her, if departed spirits are not ignorant of earthly things, that you forgive us both, that you will be a father to her dear infants. J.H." The condemned man continued to fill many sheets with his reflections in the shape of letters to his friend, but they are all rhapsodical to the last degree. The 19th April was the day fixed for his execution, and on that morning he rose at 5 o'clock, dressed himself, and spent some time in private meditation. About 7 o'clock he was visited by Mr. Boswell and some other friends, with whom he went to the chaplain and partook of the sacrament. During the procession to Tyburn he seemed much affected, and said but little. After having hung the usual time his body was carried to Surgeons' Hall. He appears to have written a few last words in pencil at Tyburn while actually waiting to be turned off. "My dear Charlie," he wrote, "farewell for ever in this world. I die a sincere Christian and penitent, and everything I hope you can wish me. Would it prevent my examples having any bad effect if the world should know how I abhor my former ideas of suicide? My crime will be the best judge. Of her fame I charge you to be careful. My poorly will. Your dying H." Miss Ray was buried at Elstree, Herts, where her grave is still pointed out. 20 years elapsed between the commission of the murder with which Governor Wall was charged, and his trial and atonement. The date of his execution was 1802, a date which would bring the story within the scope of a later rather than the present chapter. But while postponing the particulars of the execution, I propose to deal here with the offence, as it falls naturally into this branch of my subject. Colonel Wall was governor and commandant of Goree, a small island off the coast of Africa, close to Cape Verde, and now in the possession of the French. It was mainly dependent upon England for its supplies, and when these ran short, as was often the case, the troops received a money compensation in lieu of rations. A sum was due to them in this way on one occasion when both the governor and paymaster were on the point of leaving the island for England, and a number of men, anxious for an adjustment of their claims, set off in a body to interview the paymaster at his quarters. They were encountered en route by the governor, who reprimanded them and ordered them to return to their barracks. An hour or two later a second party started for the paymaster, at the head of which was a certain Sergeant Armstrong. The governor met them as before, and addressing himself to Sergeant Armstrong, again ordered the men back to their quarters. Upon the nature of this demonstration the whole of the subsequent proceedings hinged. Governor Wall and his witnesses declared it was a tumultuous gathering 70 or 80 strong. Other testimony limited the number to about a dozen. Governor Wall alleged that the men with Armstrong were armed and menacing, others that they comported themselves in a quiet, orderly manner. It was sworn that Armstrong, when spoken to by the governor, came up to him submissively, hat in hand, addressed him as Your Excellency, used no disrespectful language, and withdrew with his comrades without noise or disturbance. This view was supported by the evidence of several officers, who swore that they saw no appearance of a mutiny on the island that day. On the other hand, the governor urged that the men had declared they would break open the stores and help themselves if they were not settled with at once; that they prevented him from going to the shore, fearing he meant to leave the island in a hurry; and that they forced the main guard and released a prisoner. It is difficult to reconcile statements so widely divergent, but the fact that Governor Wall left the island next day, and took with him 3 officers out of the 7 in the garrison; that he made no special report of the alleged mutiny to the military authorities in London, and did not even refer to it in minute returns prepared and forwarded at the time, must be deemed very detrimental to Governor Wall's case, and no doubt weighed with the jury which tried him. The only conclusion was that no mutiny existed, but one was assumed merely to screen the infliction of an unauthorized punishment. To return to the events on the island, it is pretty certain that Governor Wall's mind must have been thrown off its balance after he had dismissed the party headed by Armstrong. He was either actually apprehensive for the safety of his command, or was momentarily blinded by passion at the seeming defiance of discipline, and he felt that he must make an example if his authority was to be maintained. Although many old comrades of high rank bore witness at his trial to his great humanity and good temper, there is reason to fear that to those under his command he was so severe and unaccommodating as to be generally unpopular, and this no doubt told against him at his trial. He was not a strong, self-reliant commander. It is nearly certain that he gave trifles exaggerated importance, and was only too ready to put in practice the severest methods of repression he had at hand. In this instance, however, he did not act without deliberation. It was not until 6 in the evening that he had resolved to punish Armstrong as the ringleader of the mutiny. By that time he had fully laid his plans. The long roll was beat upon the drums. The troops were assembled hurriedly as in the case of alarm, and a gun carriage was dragged into the centre of the parade. The governor then constituted a drumhead court-martial, which proceeded to try Armstrong for mutiny, convict, and sentence him without calling upon him to plead to any charge, or hearing him in his defence, so that he was practically punished without a trial. He was ordered 800 lashes, which were forthwith inflicted, not as in ordinary cases by the regimental drummers, whom the governor thought were tinged with insubordination, but by the black interpreters and his assistants. Nor was the regulation cat of 9 tails used, as the governor declared they had all been destroyed by the mutineers, but a very thick rope's end, which, according to the surgeon's testimony, did more mischief than the cat. Armstrong's punishment was exemplary. It was proved that the governor stood by, threatening to flog the blacks themselves unless they laid on with a will, and crying again and again, "Cut him to the heart, cut him to the liver." Armstrong begged for mercy, but he received the whole 800 lashes, 25 at a time, and when he was cast loose, he said that the sick season was coming on, which with the punishment would certainly do for him. A surgeon was present at the infliction, but was not called upon to certify as to Armstrong's fitness or otherwise for corporal punishment, nor did he enter any protest. Armstrong was taken at once to hospital, and his back was found as black as a new hat. From the moment of his reception the doctors had no hope of his recovery. He gradually grew worse and presently died. The day after the punishment Governor Wall left Goree and came to England, where he arrived in August 1782. The news of Armstrong's death followed him, and various reports as to the governor's conduct, which were inquired into and dismissed. But in 1784 a more detailed and circumstantial account came to hand, and two messengers were dispatched to Bath by Lord Sidney, then Secretary of State, to arrest Wall. They apprehended him and brought him as far as Reading in a chaise and four, where they alighted at an inn. While the officers were at supper he gave them the slip and got over to France, whence he wrote promising to surrender in the course of a few months. His excuse for absconding was that many of those who would be the principal witnesses were his personal enemies. He continued abroad, however, for some years, residing sometimes in Italy, more constantly in France, where he lived respectably and was admitted into good company. He affected the society of countrymen serving in the French army, and was well known to the Scotch and Irish colleges in Paris. In 1797 he returned to England, and remained in hiding, occupying lodgings in Lambeth Court, where his wife, who was a lady of good family, regularly visited him. He was described as being unsettled in mind at this time, and even then contemplating surrender. His means of subsistence were rather precarious, but he lived at the time of delivering himself up in Upper Thornhaugh Street, Bedford Square. In October 1801 he wrote twice to Lord Pelham, stating that he had returned to England for the purpose of meeting the charge against him. It was generally supposed that, had he not thus come forward voluntarily, the matter had nearly passed out of people's memory, and he would hardly have been molested. He was, however, arrested on his own letter, committed to Newgate, and tried at the Old Bailey for the murder of Benjamin Armstrong at Goree in 1782. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. After several respites and strenuous exertions to save his life, he was executed in front of Newgate on the 28th January 1802. The whole of one day was occupied by the judges and law officers in reviewing his case, but their opinion was against him. 3 persons of note and superior station found themselves in Newgate but rather before, this time upon a charge of murder. The first was James Quin, the celebrated actor, the popular diner out and bon vivant, who went to the west coast of England to eat John Dory in perfection, and who preferred eating turtle in Bristol to London. He made his first hit as Falstaff in The Merry Wives of Windsor. He had understudied the part, but Rich, manager of the Theatre Royal, London's Inn Fields, substituted him for it in an emergency with great reluctance. His next hit was as Cato, in which, with many other parts, he succeeded Booth. Quin was modest enough on his first appearance as Cato to announce that the part would be attempted by Mr. Quin. The audience were, however, fully satisfied with his performance, and after one critical passage was applauded with shouts of "Booth outdone." It was through this, his great part Cato, that he was led into the quarrel which laid him open to the charge of murder. One night in 1769, an inferior actor named Williams, taking the part of messenger, said, "Caesar sends health to Cato," but pronounced Cato Quito. Quin, much annoyed, replied instantly with a gag, "Would that he had sent a better messenger." Williams was now greatly incensed, and in the green room later in the evening complained bitterly to Quin that he had been made ridiculous, that his professional prospects were blighted, and that he insisted upon satisfaction or an apology. Quin only laughed at his rage. Williams, goaded to madness, went out into the piazza at Covent Garden to watch for Quin. When the latter left the theatre, Williams attacked him with his sword. Quin drew in his defence, and after a few passes ran Williams through the body. The ill-fated actor died on the spot. Quin surrendered himself, was committed, tried, found guilty of manslaughter, and was sentenced to be burned in the hand. Another well-known actor, Charles Macklin, was no less unfortunate in incurring the stain of blood. He was a hot-headed, intemperate Irishman who, when he had an engagement at Drury Lane Theatre, quarrelled with another actor over a wig. Going down between the pieces into the scene room, where the players warmed themselves, he saw a Mr. Hallam, who was to appear as Sancho in the Fop's Fortune, wearing a stock wig which he, Macklin, had on the night before. He swore at him for a rogue, and cried, "What business have you with my wig?" The other answered that he had as much right to it as Macklin, but presently went away and changed it for another. Macklin still would not leave the man alone, and taking the wig, began to comb it out, making grumbling and abusive remarks, and a scrub rascal. Hallam replied that he was no more a rascal than Macklin was, upon which the latter started from his chair, and having a stick in his hand, made a full lunge at the actor, and thrust the stick into his left eye. Pulling it back again, he looked pale, turned on his heel, and in a passion threw the stick on the fire. Hallam clapped his hand to his eye, and said the stick had gone through his head. Young Mr. Cibber, the manager's son, came in, and a doctor was sent for. The injured man was removed to a bed, where he expired the following day. Macklin was very contrite and concerned at his rash act, for which he was arrested, and in due course tried at the Old Bailey. Many of the most renowned actors of the day, Rich, Fleetwood, Quin, Ryan, and others, bore testimony to his good character and his quiet, peaceable disposition. He also was found guilty of manslaughter only, and sentenced to be burnt in the hand. The third case of killing by misadventure was that of Joseph Baretti, the author of the well-known Italian and English dictionary. Baretti had resided in England for some years, engaged upon this work. He was a middle-aged, respectable man of studious habits, the friend and associate of the most noted literary men and artists of the day. He was a member of the Club of the Royal Academicians at that time, 1769, lodged in Soho, and went there one afternoon after a long morning's work over his proofs. Finding no one at the club, he went on to the Orange Coffee House, and returning by the Haymarket to the club, was madly assaulted by a woman at the corner of Panton Street. Very unwisely he resented her attack by giving her a blow with his hand, when the woman, finding by his accent he was a foreigner, cried for help against the cursed Frenchman, when there was at once a gathering of bullies, who jostled and beat Baretti, making him apprehensive that he must expect no favour nor protection, but all outrage and blows. There was generally a great puddle at the corner of Panton Street, even when the weather was fine, and on this particular day it had rained incessantly, and the pavement was very slippery. Baretti's assailants tried hard to push him into the puddle, and at last, in self-defence, he drew his pocket-knife, a knife he kept, as he afterwards declared, to carve fruit and sweetmeats, and not to kill his fellow creatures with, being hard pushed in great horror, having such bad eyes, lest he should run against some, and his pursuers constantly at him, jostling and beating him. Baretti made a quick blow at one who had knocked off his hat with his fist. The mob cried, "Murder! He has a knife out!" and gave way. Baretti ran up Oxenden Street, then faced about and ran into a shop for protection, being quite spent with fatigue. 3 men followed him. One was a constable, who had called upon Baretti to surrender. Morgan, the man whom he had stabbed 3 times, as it appeared, the third wound having hurt him more than the 2 former, was fast bleeding to death. Baretti was carried before Sir John Fielding. His friends came from the club and testified to his character, among others Sir Joshua Reynolds himself, but he was committed to prison. It was urged in Baretti's defence that he had been very severely handled. He had a swollen cheek, and was covered with bruises. Independent witnesses came forward, and swore that they had been subjected to personal outrage in the neighbourhood of the Haymarket. A number of personal friends, including Sir Joshua Reynolds, Dr. Johnson, Mr. Fitzherbert, and Mr. Edmund Burke, spoke in the highest terms of Mr. Baretti as a man of benevolence, sobriety, modesty, and learning. In the end he was acquitted of murder or manslaughter, and the jury gave a verdict of self-defence. End of Later Records, Part 2.